Dusk pressed hard against the Montana foothills, smothering the last pale light under thick bands of winter cloud. Fiona Brooks gripped the steering wheel of her battered Tacoma, the wipers thrumming frantic as the wind howled across the frozen ruts. Snow battered sideways, plastering her windshield, narrowing her world to the shaky beam of her headlights. Every mile felt harder as she wound up the dirt road toward her small, lonely repair shop, her hands aching, her mind tight with the kind of exhaustion that never seemed to let go these days. Just as she eased around a sharp bend, something flashed, wild and low, in the headlights. Instinct, not thought, sent her foot slamming on the brakes. The truck slid, fishtailing on the ice, and stopped just shy of a lean brown Mustang, standing stone still in the glare. The horse's sides heaved, her coat glistened, slicked with rain and blood. In the chaos of snow, Fiona saw the animal's eyes, wide, wild, but locked on her with an almost human question. She killed the engine, heart hammering, and stepped out slowly, careful not to spook the mare. Wind knifed through her jacket. With one hand, Fiona pulled the faded firefighter's bandana from her pocket, her old, frayed talisman, and held it out as a kind of peace offering. Her boots crunched on the frozen gravel. The horse pinned her ears, nostrils flaring, legs trembling, but didn't bolt. Fiona could see the exhaustion in every shuddering breath. This was a creature running on empty, too battered to flee. Just then, headlights swept up behind her, flooding the scene in harsh yellow. Fiona glanced back. A battered pickup, engine idling, sitting too long in the road. She couldn't make out the driver's face, but she felt the air thicken, charged with something unspoken and dangerous. No one rolled down a window. The truck just sat, waiting. Fiona's focus snapped back to the horse. The Mustang wore a ragged halter, caked with mud and blood, and from it dangled two battered tags. The first was so worn the numbers were illegible, but the second, hanging lower, read a single word: Cull, disposable. Fiona's chest tightened. She'd seen enough to know what that meant. A gust drove the snow in fresh sheets. Fiona inched closer, murmuring old lines of campfire songs, her voice steady even as her nerves rattled. Slowly, impossibly, the mare let her close enough to touch her shoulder, trembling, battered, but too spent to resist. With a patience she'd forgotten she still had, Fiona clipped a lead rope to the halter and coaxed the Mustang, step by halting step, toward the horse trailer parked under her pines. The headlights behind her didn't budge. The driver waited, watching, as if judging every movement. When at last the mare staggered up the ramp, Fiona paused, glancing back at the pickup still sitting in the road. The engine revved, then faded, the headlights drifting away into the snow-laced dark. Only then did Fiona let out the breath she'd been holding, her hands shaking. Inside the barn, lantern light flickered across wood and hay as Fiona led the horse inside. The mare, later she would learn her name was Thistle, stood, shivering, blood seeping from a long gash along her neck. Fiona knelt, her scarred hand gentle, the old rescue radio set nearby, her lifeline to a world she mostly tried to avoid. Outside, the wind howled, battering the tin roof. Fiona worked quietly, humming, hands steady even as her mind raced. She cleaned the wounds, tore strips from her old shirts for bandages, let Thistle drink and eat. Every touch was slow, every movement deliberate. Years of firefighting and loss had taught Fiona that most things, even pain, could be endured if you faced them without flinching. At one point, Thistle reared, driven by a burst of thunder that shook the barn's rafters. Fiona braced herself, arms up, not to control, but to wait out the panic. She spoke softly, her words almost lost in the storm. The horse's eyes rolled, breath wild, but finally she settled, the fear draining out of her like the last surge of a dying fire. Later, as the barn stilled, Fiona found herself sitting in the hay, watching the Mustang eat. She took in every detail: the lean lines, the scars old and new, the sun-bleached mane, the wary intelligence in those deep brown eyes. She saw in Thistle a kind of mirror, both marked, both survivors, both carrying stories no one else could see. But as Fiona listened to the wind scrape at the door, another sound crept in, the slow crunch of tires on gravel. She moved to the window. Far down the drive, the same battered pickup lingered, headlights barely visible through the trees. It waited a moment, then slipped away, swallowed by the storm. Back inside, Fiona clipped the old bandana around her wrist, ran a shaky hand over her scar, and settled down to watch over the Mustang. The sense of being watched, of danger not quite named, hung in the air. She checked the locks twice before finally letting herself rest, one ear tuned to the breathing of the wild horse beside her. Tonight, two creatures, both marked as disposable, both battered by storms they never chose, shared shelter. And neither, Fiona vowed, would be abandoned again. A blizzard battered the metal siding of Fiona's barn, and for the first time in months, she didn't feel alone in the echo of her own life. Lantern light painted soft gold on the rough boards, throwing shadows that danced over Thistle's battered body as Fiona set to work. It was past midnight. Outside, the world disappeared in swirling white, but inside, every sense was taut and focused. Thistle trembled in her makeshift stall, wariness flickering through every muscle as Fiona approached with a basin of warm water. Her coat, caked in mud and dried blood, told stories of the days before. Desperate flight, rough hands, perhaps worse. Fiona crouched low, not making eye contact, and began to sing in a low, rough voice, a tune she once hummed on night patrols, years back when fire and smoke filled the sky. The Mustang's ears flicked, half an ear toward the sound, half on high alert. She started with the worst wound, a long, angry gash along Thistle's neck, already half scabbed and sticky with cold. Thunder rumbled, making the rafters tremble. Thistle tensed, muscles coiled as if ready to explode. Fiona kept her hand steady, the old scar on her palm glinting in the lantern light as she dabbed ointment on the wound, never flinching as Thistle's hooves stamped and shifted. Suddenly, a sharp crack, thunder or something heavier, shook the barn. Thistle exploded upward, rearing back, hooves striking against the stall's old pine beam with a sound like gunfire. Fiona's pulse hammered. She pressed herself against the wall, hands raised, not in fear, but in patience. "It's okay, girl," she whispered. "Let it out. I'm not going anywhere." The mare crashed down, nostrils wide, heart pounding. For a long moment, she stared Fiona down, wild and cornered. Then, as if all her energy drained in that one surge, Thistle sagged. Fiona approached again, slower still, laying the bandana, now stained from the road, over the mare's withers as a sign of peace. They worked this way through the long hours of the night. Bandages, water, soft murmurs, and the old radio's static comfort. Now and then, Fiona would hear the wind change, or the faintest creak from outside, and her hand would drift automatically to the scar on her left palm, a habit from days spent waiting for the fire to change direction, for disaster to strike again. Dawn threatened behind the storm. Fiona slipped out to check the gate, her boots crunching on a thick new layer of snow. That's when she saw it, a slip of paper, fluttering against the splintered wood, held in place by a single rusty tack. The words were blocky, rushed. "She's not yours. Let her go before it's too late." A spike of cold sliced through the warmth she'd built in the barn. Fiona scanned the tree line, heart thumping. Whoever had left the note hadn't been shy. Tire tracks marked circles around her property, carving deep, fresh ruts in the snow. Someone had come close, watched, left their message, and vanished again into the dark. Back in the barn, she watched Thistle sleep standing up, head drooping, exhaustion finally overcoming terror. Fiona's phone, signal wavering in the storm, managed a weak call to an old friend at the BLM. She rattled off the details. Mare, brown, sun-bleached mane, fresh wounds, faded halter with cull tag. There was a long pause on the other end. Then the voice came back, guarded. "Records on that last roundup are sealed. Off the books. And you're not the only one asking. 3, maybe 4 Mustangs are missing. Somebody's covering their tracks, Fee." The old firefighter in her wanted to rush, to push. But this was a different kind of danger. One that hid in shadows, worked in whispers. Fiona hung up, staring at her radio, the bandana, the sleeping Mustang, and the note on her gate. Fear crawled under her skin, but she forced herself to breathe, to move. She changed out the barn's locks, double-checked the back door, and kept the old rescue radio on, its static whisper a comfort in the rising dawn. As the morning broke, she poured coffee thick as tar, fighting a bone-deep exhaustion. The world outside looked fresh, clean, even beautiful, but the illusion didn't last. She checked again. Those same tire tracks, pressed deep and tight, circling, looping back on themselves. Someone had watched her, maybe waited for her to go inside. She stared into the trees, unable to shake the feeling that the dark hadn't fully receded. Thistle was standing when Fiona returned, more alert now, ears pricked toward the door. Fiona brought an apple from her kitchen, cut it in quarters, and held out a piece. The Mustang hesitated, nostrils flaring, then snatched the fruit, eyes never leaving Fiona's face. Throughout the day, the tension in the barn refused to fade. Every time a truck rumbled down the road, Thistle tensed, muscles rippling under her battered coat. Fiona kept a wrench in her pocket, checked her old bandana for luck, and wondered what kind of trouble she'd really brought home last night. She thought of calling her daughter in Missoula, but stopped. What could she say? "Hey, honey, I found a half-dead Mustang marked for disposal and now someone's circling the house?" "No, not yet. Some burdens you just carried yourself." Later that morning, as the sun burned off the worst of the storm, Fiona stepped outside to clear the path. The snow was crusted, heavy, already melting where her boots pressed. She knelt to examine the tire tracks more closely, spotting a piece of plastic wedged in the churned-up slush. She pocketed it, thinking maybe it would mean something, later. Back inside, Thistle watched her, one dark eye following every movement. Fiona busied herself with chores, cleaning the wound again, making sure the water bucket was full, laying fresh straw. Each act was small, but together they knit a fragile safety between woman and horse. But as darkness fell again, Fiona caught her own reflection in the barn window, tired, scarred, wary as the Mustang she'd rescued. She saw in herself the same mixture of hope and fear, both marked by old wounds, both refusing to give in. That night, Fiona sat on a hay bale, bandana looped around her wrist, radio humming low, watching over Thistle. The wind had calmed, but in its place came a thick, heavy silence, one that warned her this was only the beginning. Montana's late winter loosened its grip slowly, almost reluctantly, as days crept forward. For Fiona, time stretched and knotted, each hour spent tending to Thistle marked by small, careful gestures and the silent, steady weight of worry. The snow outside melted just enough to reveal patches of mud, stubborn stalks of last summer's grass, and the twisted tire ruts that circled her property like a warning left behind. Mornings became ritual. Fiona would step into the barn before sunrise, the air still sharp, breath rising in faint clouds. She kept her movements slow, never approaching Thistle head-on. The mare's eyes tracked every shift in the light, every brush of hay or whisper of cloth. Fiona talked to her, not just soft nothings, but stories, half-remembered campfire songs, even bits of her own past. "You don't owe anybody your trust," she would say, her voice gentle, "but you can rest here for as long as you want." For 3 days, Thistle barely moved except to eat and drink, always at the farthest edge of her stall, hooves planted like she might vanish at any second. Fiona let her be, focusing instead on chores she could do close by. She fixed the loose stall door, replaced the broken hinge on the hayloft, and patched a leak in the roof, all with the old tools her father left her, humming low and steady, letting the Mustang watch. Gradually, the rhythm between them shifted. On the 4th morning, Fiona found Thistle standing closer, her muzzle almost touching the edge of the stall. Fiona didn't reach out. Instead, she settled beside her, back against the wall, and began eating her breakfast, a cold biscuit and a sliver of cheese. After a long moment, Thistle reached down and nipped at a piece Fiona offered, her eyes darting away the moment she took it. That afternoon, Fiona led Thistle out into the small fenced paddock, coaxing her with patience and the promise of open sky. At first, the Mustang moved stiffly, every muscle tense, but the scent of thawing earth seemed to draw something gentle out of her. For nearly an hour, she stood near the fence line, sides heaving, just breathing. Fiona watched from the porch, careful not to crowd her, and let the quiet do the work. One night, while checking the barn for leaks after another rain, Fiona heard a faint, distressed yowl. She traced the sound to a pile of old hay and discovered a feral cat, trapped and trembling, its leg caught in baling twine. Before Fiona could step closer, Thistle surged between them, lowering her head protectively over the little creature. It was the first time Fiona saw the mare's vigilance turn outward, fierce but not violent. She crouched, speaking softly to both, working the twine loose until the cat jerked free and darted out into the night. Thistle snorted and stayed by Fiona's side, as if recognizing her intention. In the quiet that followed, Fiona's heart tightened, not with fear, but something else, the fragile beginning of trust, spun out of shared vigilance and small mercies. Days passed. Thistle began to follow Fiona, never close, always with a few feet of caution, but with clear intent. If Fiona worked by the barn, Thistle would shadow her, nostrils flaring if anyone else came near. She never let her guard down fully, and Fiona respected that. Understanding the cost of broken promises, the weather gave them a few days of bright false spring. Fiona set up her workbench by the barn doors and spent the afternoons restoring an old outboard motor, the rhythmic clink of metal and the scent of oil mixing with the mountain air. Thistle lingered nearby, ears flicking at every new sound, but drawn in by the steadiness of Fiona's presence. When the wind gusted or a branch snapped, the mare would startle, eyes wide, but she never bolted, not as long as Fiona was within sight. One evening, as shadows lengthened, Fiona sat in the paddock, knees drawn up, listening to the distant rush of the river. Thistle came closer than ever before, pausing just an arm's length away. Fiona felt the urge to reach out, but resisted, letting the silence stretch. The Mustang sniffed the air, then lowered her head, chewing on a strand of hay, content. That was all Fiona needed. Permission to share space, to be trusted with something so vulnerable. Later that night, as she brushed out Thistle's tangled mane by lantern light, Fiona's fingers traced a patch of rough, scarred skin on the mare's neck. Beneath the old wound, she felt the faintest ridge, a hidden brand, nearly lost beneath layers of healed-over trauma. She parted the hair and revealed the ghostly imprint, evidence of an illegal sale, the kind of mark that told a story of betrayal, not rescue. Fiona's hands stilled, anger prickling through her exhaustion. She took a photo with her phone, careful not to startle Thistle. There was no mistaking it. This was a Mustang someone had tried to erase, to hide from the world. She wrote down the numbers, if any could still be read, and sent a message to her BLM contact. Her gut churning with dread. Whatever had happened to Thistle wasn't just bad luck. It was part of something darker. That night, Fiona couldn't sleep. She lay on the old cot she kept in the barn's tack room, listening to Thistle shift and breathe, the rhythmic sound oddly comforting. She remembered the feel of fire lines under her boots, the weight of a friend's hand on her shoulder in the thick of smoke. Trust, she knew, was never given freely. It had to be earned, again and again, in the small hours and the silent spaces. Outside, the sky cleared for the first time in weeks, stars blazing cold above the foothills. Fiona drifted off at last, one hand on the old rescue radio, a promise settling quietly between woman and horse. They were in this together, come what may. The thaw came gradually, trickling through the days like a rumor of better things. But peace in Fiona's world always felt temporary, like the break between storms. As the foothills shed their last dirty snow, the mud thickened and the air sharpened with the promise of spring. It should have been a relief, but Fiona felt the tension wound tighter than ever, a current humming just beneath the daily routine. Her repair shop, a squat building with a faded sign, sat at the edge of her property. On good mornings, she left the doors open and let the scent of thawing earth drift in as she worked. Old radios, busted generators, stubborn chainsaws stacked in neat rows. Thistle grazed near the barn, never wandering far, her wariness replaced by a new kind of alertness. If a stranger's truck rumbled down the road, the mare would raise her head and stare, muscles bunched until the threat passed. It started with small things. A screwdriver went missing from the workbench. The lock on the tack room hung open, swinging gently in the wind. Fiona chalked it up to distraction at first. She was tired, the kind of tired that made details slip. But then she found muddy boot prints by the back door one morning, and a deep chill settled under her skin. The next day, she stepped into her shop and stopped cold. Glass crunched under her boots. The window facing the road was shattered, and her tools, meticulously organized, were tossed into chaos. The old radio she'd rebuilt for a neighbor was gone. Spray painted on the wall in jagged black was a single word: thief. For a long moment, Fiona stood perfectly still, the scar on her hand itching. Her mind spiraled back to those old, smoky days, fires out of nowhere, orders shouted in confusion, the chaos of crisis. But here, now, there was only silence and the distant call of a hawk. She called the sheriff's office, explained what had happened, and got little more than a promise to swing by soon. The deputy's tone was tired, uninterested. Fiona could hear him shuffling paperwork in the background. Probably some kids, he said. Nothing worth getting worked up over. Fiona hung up and ran her thumb along her old bandana, the fabric soft and familiar. She stared at the broken glass, the scattered tools, and felt the old urge to run, pack up, disappear, leave trouble behind. But she looked out at Thistle, standing by the paddock gate, ears pointed toward the shop, and something inside her refused to give in. That evening, Fiona called her daughter in Missoula. "Mom," came the worried voice through the static. "What's really going on out there?" Fiona hesitated, then told her about the shop, the threats, the feeling of being watched. She tried to keep her voice steady, tried to sound like the mother her daughter remembered, unshakable, brave. But even across the miles, her fear crept in, unguarded. "I'm scared, honey. Not for me, well, maybe a little, but for Thistle. Someone wants her back, and I don't think they care who gets hurt." There was a pause, then, "You always told me to stand my ground, Mom, to do the right thing even if it was hard. I don't want you to get hurt, but I'm proud of you." The words left Fiona blinking hard at the setting sun. Sometimes, she realized, courage was as much about not hiding as it was about fighting. Later, as dusk pressed in, Fiona finished her chores. She moved quietly, every sense stretched thin. She noticed the way Thistle pressed close to the stall door as she approached, anxious, but not from fear of her. The mare let Fiona run a hand down her neck, fingers gliding over the patch of rough skin where the hidden brand lay. For the first time, Thistle didn't flinch. She closed her eyes, jaw working quietly, and Fiona felt a seismic shift, a trust finally settling, brittle but real. Night settled heavy. The barn lights cast a narrow pool of safety in the dark. Fiona set up a cot in the tack room, radio close, wrench under her pillow. She drifted in and out of uneasy sleep, jolting awake at every creak, every gust that rattled the roof. The next afternoon, a kid from the neighboring ranch, barely 16, hair falling in his eyes, showed up at the fence. He looked nervous, shifting from foot to foot, hands stuffed deep in his jacket. "You got a brown Mustang here?" he asked, voice thin. "Some guys have been driving around, asking about a lost horse. Showed me pictures. Didn't like the way they talked, so—" He trailed off, glancing at Thistle, then back at Fiona. Fiona's gut twisted. She thanked the boy, pressed a $10 bill into his hand, and watched him jog back down the lane. Every instinct screamed to run, to hide Thistle deeper in the hills. But there was nowhere left to go. Not for her. Not for the mare. As evening bled into night, Fiona double-checked the barn locks and strung up an old bell from her firefighting days, its clang sharp, a warning and a comfort. She kept the radio close and her old bandana tied tight around her wrist, the talisman of battles survived and still to come. Inside the barn, Thistle stood calm under her touch, a silent sentinel in the gloom. Outside, the shadows pressed closer, thick with secrets and the promise of more trouble. But for the first time since the storm, Fiona felt something else beneath the fear, a resolve, quietly unbreakable, that whatever darkness prowled these hills, she and Thistle would meet it together. A cold front swept in from the north, smothering Helena's outskirts with leaden clouds and slicing winds. The world outside grew hushed and brittle, a stillness before the next storm. By late afternoon, the sky had gone the color of an old bruise, and the air crackled with static. Fiona knew the feeling, a warning, a tightening. Instinct made her check the barn doors twice, gather extra hay, and test her generator just in case. Dusk came fast, pressing against the windows as the first flakes drifted down. The power flickered, then vanished, plunging Fiona's small house and the barn beyond into a darkness broken only by lantern glow. She felt her pulse quicken. Old firefighting habits kicked in. Locate the flashlights, the emergency radio, double-check the lockbox for extra batteries. But tonight, it wasn't just the storm outside that troubled Fiona. The day's small anxieties, missing tools, the neighbor kid's warning, Thistle's anxious pacing, had all merged into something heavier, dragging at her thoughts. She couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Even inside the barn, the wind found its way through every crack, whistling cold down her neck. She settled into the straw near Thistle's stall, pulling her knees to her chest and wrapping the faded bandana around her wrist. The mare, restless but not wild, paced the length of her stall. Lantern light flickered over the scarred patch on her neck, casting long shadows. Fiona tried to focus on the here and now, but her mind kept sliding back. Years, decades, to another night and another storm. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind howl, and let the memories surface. She saw herself as a younger woman, standing on the edge of a wildfire, smoke thick, sirens wailing, the scent of burning pine everywhere. She remembered the radio crackling in her hand, her friend, Melissa, calling for help from across a wall of flame. No matter how many times she replayed it, she never found the words to explain what went wrong. She'd tried to get to Melissa, tried to lead her out, but the wind shifted, the fire rolled, and the smoke swallowed everything. That was the night she earned the scar on her palm, a last desperate grab for burning metal, a searing pain that stayed long after the flames died out. She'd never forgiven herself, not really, and that guilt had seeped into every part of her life, as deep and stubborn as the scars she now shared with the Mustang. She didn't notice she was crying until Thistle pressed close to the bars, breath huffing against Fiona's shoulder. For a moment, she let herself lean in, letting the mare's quiet warmth fill the space where words failed. Her tears came silent, hot, and finally free. There was no one else to see her, not daughter, not friend, not the world she'd long ago closed herself off from. Only Thistle stood witness, the horse's presence solid, real, unwavering. The storm raged for hours, rattling the tin roof, shaking the old boards. Thunder boomed, and the lights stayed stubbornly dead. But inside the barn, something subtle shifted, a letting go, a breaking open. Fiona sat there for what felt like years, not moving, not trying to fix anything. She just existed in the darkness, the smell of hay and horse and storm-soaked earth grounding her. As dawn finally peeled the shadows away, a soft gray light slipped through the cracks. Fiona rubbed her swollen eyes and straightened, stiff from sleep and sorrow. Thistle stood beside her, head high, ears pricked, waiting. There was a clarity in the air, sharp, almost painful. For the first time in a long time, Fiona felt something like hope. She stood, her legs unsteady, and pressed her forehead gently to Thistle's. They moved out into the barnyard together. The world was washed clean, ice crystals glittering on every branch. Fiona turned the old rescue radio on, letting the faint hum fill the quiet. She opened the big doors, and Thistle stepped forward into the pale sunlight, nostrils flaring, eyes wide but unafraid. The day unfolded in slow, small pieces. Fiona made coffee on her camp stove, warming her hands around the mug. She brushed Thistle's coat, careful over the scars, humming the same old tune. Every action felt deliberate, a choice to keep moving, to refuse the paralyzing fear that so often dogged her steps. As she mucked out the stalls, she caught sight of her own reflection in a puddle, hair wild, face streaked with exhaustion. and something softer. She realized, with a kind of start, that it wasn't just Thistle who was learning to trust. It was her, too, learning to forgive, to risk, to stand in the open instead of the shadows. Later, she jotted a few words in her battered journal, trying to capture the lesson she could barely name. The fear of loss was what kept them both alive, but it was also what kept them searching for connection, for safety, for something beyond just surviving. That afternoon, as the wind settled and the sky cleared, Fiona took Thistle for a slow walk around the paddock. The mare moved close, her gait easy, occasionally brushing against Fiona's sleeve. There was still danger in the world. She could feel it just out of sight, but for now, the quiet was enough. That evening, Fiona called her daughter, voice steadier this time. She spoke not just of the threats and the vandalism, but of the storm, of Thistle's presence, of the night spent letting old pain finally break through. "I think I'm finally learning, kid," she said, smiling into the receiver. "Learning to let someone in again, even if she's got 4 legs and a wild streak." She heard her daughter's laughter, soft and proud, echoing through the line. The moment settled deep, like the warmth of a campfire on a cold night. Night came again, but this time Fiona slept easier, the barn quiet except for the even sound of Thistle's breathing. Somewhere in that dark, she realized, healing had begun, not as a grand gesture, but as a simple act of standing beside another soul and refusing, just for now, to give up. Spring arrived in fits and starts, the chill refusing to fully leave the Montana air. By now, Fiona had settled into a fragile rhythm, long mornings fixing fence posts and shop equipment, afternoons with Thistle in the thawed paddock, evenings making slow repairs on both the barn and the hurts she still carried. But as the land softened, so did the boundaries that kept danger at bay. Fiona began to notice small things out of place: a broken fence rail, a gate left half-latched, fresh tire ruts pressed deep into the back trail. One morning, as she walked the fence line, she caught sight of boot prints in the mud, too large and too recent to be hers or the neighbor kids'. They led from the edge of the woods to her property's far side, then disappeared. She crouched, touching the impression, pulse beating hard in her throat. Thistle, grazing nearby, raised her head, ears pricked to the distance. That night, Fiona returned to her truck after a supply run to town and found a note wedged under her wiper blade. No envelope, just a torn scrap of paper scrawled in thick marker, "You're making a mistake. Walk away. Last warning." Fiona looked up quickly, scanning the grocery store parking lot, but no one lingered. Her hands trembled as she pocketed the note. For the first time in years, she felt hunted, her skin crawling as if the eyes that watched her had followed her from the lonely roads all the way to the heart of town. She drove home with her jaw clenched tight, locking every door and checking every window before she could finally breathe. A few nights later, long after midnight, Fiona was jolted awake by a metallic clang and a desperate whinny. She grabbed her flashlight, boots half-laced, and sprinted for the barn. The main gate was open, swinging wildly in the wind. Thistle was gone. Panic crashed through her. She snatched the rescue radio and bolted into the dark, calling Thistle's name. Flashlight beam cutting through the black, she found chaos at the edge of the woods. Broken fence, fresh boot prints, the glint of metal in the grass. And there, struggling against a pair of rough hands, was Thistle, eyes wild with terror. Fiona didn't hesitate. She charged, wielding her flashlight like a weapon, shouting with all the force of a wildfire chief. The man, broad-shouldered, hoodie pulled low, tried to drag Thistle toward a waiting pickup, but the mare reared, hooves flashing, With a cry, she kicked backward, striking the man's arm with a sickening crack. He cursed and fell, clutching his limb. Fiona lunged between him and Thistle, voice steady, eyes locked on the intruder. For a tense, suspended moment, the only sound was Thistle's frantic breathing and the intruder's pain. Then, headlights snapped on from the waiting truck. The would-be captor stumbled toward it, clutching his broken arm, and the vehicle peeled away, spinning mud. Fiona pressed her hand to Thistle's neck, murmuring reassurances, her heart pounding so loudly she felt faint. When she called the sheriff, the response was everything she'd feared. An overworked deputy, his voice flat and tired. "You're sure it wasn't a bear or a stray? Horses spook easy." She insisted, voice shaking but resolute, that it was a man. There were boot prints, a note, broken fencing, a truck that sped away. The deputy promised to look into it, but never showed. The next morning, she found the same old indifference waiting at the end of the phone line. The message was clear. She was on her own. Thistle, shaken but uninjured, hovered near Fiona the rest of the day, never letting her drift far. The horse, once wild and withdrawn, now circled Fiona like a shadow. Every passing truck on the county road sent her into fits of alertness, hooves pawing at the ground, muscles tensed to run. Fiona found herself more vigilant than ever, double-locking the barn, walking the property at all hours. Each night she lay awake, the old rescue radio humming, the fear sharpening into resolve. That evening she called her daughter. The worry in the young woman's voice was sharper than ever. "Mom, this isn't safe, please. Just let them have the horse. It isn't worth your life." Fiona gripped the phone, her scarred hand whitening with tension. "I can't," she whispered. "Thistle's not just another stray. She was thrown away, again and again. I'm not going to be another person who abandons her. I couldn't live with myself." There was a long silence, then, "You're as stubborn as that horse," her daughter said, voice trembling with equal parts fear and pride. That night, Fiona's mind spun with memories and doubt. The world seemed to shrink, her property line, her small circle of trust, the wounded Mustang at her side. She paced the barn, running through everything she knew, trying to piece together the story behind the threats. The image of the hidden brand on Thistle's neck haunted her. The next morning, she made a decision. She pulled out the slip of plastic she'd found by the tire ruts days ago, a broken piece from a license plate frame, with just enough numbers to go on. After a flurry of calls, a friend in the county office ran the partial plate. The match came back, a local ranch, owned by a man long rumored for shady dealings and cruelty. Animal control had been there before, but nothing ever stuck. Fiona stood at the kitchen counter, phone in hand, the morning sun barely touching the frost outside. For the first time, the shadow had a name, a place, a real threat. And if they thought she was going to back down, they didn't know her at all. As the day faded, Fiona sat with Thistle in the barn, feeling the horse's breath against her arm. She pressed her forehead to Thistle's warm neck, whispered, "We're not running. Not this time." Outside, the wind rattled the pines, but inside, the air was thick with stubborn hope, a promise forged by fire and loss that neither of them would be left behind again. First light had barely brushed the hills when Fiona woke to chaos. A crash, the pounding of hooves, and the frantic whinny of Thistle cutting through the dawn haze. Her breath fogged in the cold as she bolted upright, snatching the rescue radio and stumbling into boots. The barn door hung crooked, half off its hinges. She heard shouting, men's voices tangled in the wind. Fiona sprinted through the yard, her heart in her throat. In the blue-gray light, she caught the shapes of two men, backs bent, arms flung wide, trying to drive Thistle toward a battered horse trailer backed up by the trees. The Mustang was wild with terror, eyes rolling, breath steaming, every muscle coiled to bolt. One man waved a rope, the other snapped a whip at her heels, their shouts echoing across the clearing. Fiona didn't hesitate. She plunged into the chaos, voice raw and commanding. "Get away from her!" The men spun, startled, but one shoved her roughly to the ground. Pain shot through her shoulder as she hit the frozen earth, but she clambered up, clutching her radio. "Help!" she yelled into the static, using the old code words she hadn't needed in years. "Immediate assistance, Brooks Ranch. Attempted animal theft. North fence." The men closed in, one grabbing her by the arm, twisting hard. But before he could pull her away, Thistle exploded, charging at the intruder with a furious, untamed power. The man dropped Fiona and staggered back as the Mustang snapped her teeth and kicked, her hooves slicing the air with lethal precision. The trailer's open gate became a snare, the men scrambling over themselves as Thistle drove them off, her wild charge scattering them into the trees. Fiona scrambled to her feet, shaking, adrenaline burning through every nerve. She pressed the radio close, repeating her location, her voice steadier now. "Need backup, now! Suspects fleeing on foot, north side." In the near distance, tires screeched. The trailer's engine revved, the driver panicking as the battered truck tried to pull away too fast, fishtailing in the mud. Just as the truck sped toward the main road, Fiona's neighbor, a wiry man named Leo, skidded up in his old Dodge, blocking the exit. The men inside the trailer cursed and tried to reverse, but the local vet's pickup roared up behind, pinning them in. The thieves, realizing they were surrounded, bolted from the cab and vanished into the trees, leaving the battered trailer rocking, its back gate flapping in the morning wind. Thistle stood, trembling but unbowed, sides heaving. Fiona rushed to her, wrapping her arms around the mare's neck, feeling the frantic thump of her heart. "It's okay, girl, you did it. You're safe." Thistle snorted, her head pressing against Fiona's chest, sweat slicking her coat. The sheriff finally arrived, late but present, accompanied by wildlife officers. They swept the woods, finding evidence abandoned in haste. Lengths of rope, a bag of halters, a notepad stuffed with dates and names. The officers moved with grim efficiency, photographing the scene, dusting the trailer for prints. Leo and the vet, Mary, cheeks flushed and hair askew, stayed by Fiona's side, shaking their heads in disbelief. Fiona handed over the notes she'd gathered, the photos of Thistle's hidden brand, the threatening letters. She watched the officers photograph the scene, their faces hardening as the evidence piled up. It wasn't just about a stolen horse anymore. There were documents, names, and numbers linking the attackers to something bigger. A Mustang smuggling ring, moving wild horses across state lines, branding and selling them off the books. As the morning wore on, more neighbors arrived, drawn by the commotion. Word spread quickly. Fiona Brooks's Mustang had nearly been taken. The sheriff's deputies gathered statements, but it was clear the community was already rallying. Leo barked orders. Mary offered tea and blankets to Fiona and Thistle, while a handful of others kept watch by the road, their presence a shield against any returning threat. Through it all, Fiona felt an old part of herself resurface. The leader, the one who stood in fire and chaos and refused to break. She coordinated with the deputies, handed out evidence, and made calls to animal welfare groups and BLM contacts. Her voice was strong, her hands steady. Thistle, still shaking, never let Fiona drift far. By afternoon, as clouds gathered again on the horizon, The authorities towed away the stolen trailer. One deputy approached Fiona, voice low. "This ring goes deep. The brand on your horse. There are others. We're putting you and your place on extra patrol. But be careful. These people don't give up easy." Fiona nodded, exhaustion settling into her bones. She watched as the trucks rolled away, neighbors drifting home, the world slowly returning to its uneasy calm. But a sense of victory, shaky but real, settled over the barnyard. They'd fought back, together. That night, Fiona sat with Thistle, brushing her coat by lantern light, hands gentle and unhurried. The mare's wounds would heal, scars fading into stories. "You saved me as much as I saved you," Fiona whispered, her voice breaking a little. "We're not alone anymore." In the silence, the distant hum of a patrol car drifted down the road. Fiona let herself believe, just for a moment, that the world might be turning in their favor. For the first time in months, she slept without fear. Thistle standing guard outside the window, wild, brave, and finally, home. By the time the sun rose over the valley, word of the attack on Fiona's ranch had rippled across Helena's rural backroads. Trucks rolled slow past her property, not in menace this time, but in quiet support. Neighbors keeping watch, heads nodding at Fiona as she worked the fence line, shotgun slung over one shoulder, Thistle never more than a few paces away. That morning, the barn was crowded for the first time since Fiona bought the place. The local vet, Mary, arrived early with a first aid kit and strong coffee, gently tending to the bruises on Thistle's flanks, while quietly urging Fiona to get her own shoulder checked. The neighbor boy, freckle-faced, shy, helped muck out stalls. By midday, 2 wildlife officers, a BLM agent, and a reporter from the Helena Tribune were standing in the yard, boots muddy, notepads in hand. Fiona felt the shift immediately. A story taking shape, people gathering, voices overlapping in concern and anger. She pulled out her folder of evidence, the threatening notes, photographs of the hidden brand, pieces of rope and the broken license plate frame. The BLM agent, a hard-eyed woman in her 50s, examined the brand beneath Thistle's mane and nodded grimly. "This is big," she said quietly. "We've suspected something for a while, but never had anyone brave enough to push it this far. You just gave us a smoking gun." The wildlife officers dusted the trailer and the stolen halters for fingerprints. "We'll match these prints to state records," one of them said. "If we're lucky, this'll crack the whole operation open." Fiona felt the weight of the months fall away, replaced by adrenaline and a cold sense of mission. She called her BLM friend, relayed every detail, and sent photos of the evidence. Her voice didn't waver this time. She spoke with the calm, clipped confidence of her firefighter days, laying out the threats, the attempted theft, the hidden brand, and the trail that led back to the ranch known for cruelty. The Tribune reporter wanted photos of Thistle for the paper. "She's the face of this story," the young woman said, eyes kind behind her camera, "a survivor." Thistle, wary of the crowd but trusting in Fiona's steady presence, stood tall beside her. The reporter snapped shots of the mare's proud, scarred face, the soft light catching the paler streak of her mane, a portrait of resilience. By late afternoon, the local animal welfare group showed up with sandwiches and a promise to rally support. They took statements from Fiona, her neighbors, and even the boy who'd warned her weeks ago. The story, it seemed, had grown legs, and a community was walking it forward. For the first time in months, Fiona's daughter came home. She drove in from Missoula, a look of worried awe on her face as she hugged her mother tight. "I saw you on the news," she whispered. "You did it, Mom. You stood up for her. I'm so damn proud of you." Fiona felt herself crumble just a little, the old wall softening as she leaned into her daughter's embrace. It struck her then. This fight, this stubborn refusal to let go of Thistle, wasn't just about a horse. It was about not letting fear dictate who she was anymore. It was about standing up, not just for herself, but for anyone who'd ever been written off, marked cull, or cast aside. As darkness settled, the BLM and the wildlife officers called with news. The evidence from Fiona's ranch matched fingerprints from several open cases. That night, a coordinated raid swept across 3 properties on the outskirts of town. Dozens of Mustangs, many scarred, branded, half-starved, were rescued. Fiona watched on the local news as law enforcement led the suspected ringleaders away in cuffs, their faces pale and tight with anger. The smuggling ring, which had quietly operated across state lines for years, was busted. The next morning, TV crews and reporters descended on Fiona's place. Cameras flashed, microphones shoved into her face, each question sharper than the last. But Fiona held her ground, Thistle at her side, speaking with a steady voice. "I'm not special," she told them. "I just refuse to look away. These animals deserve better. So do the people who try to save them." The community responded in force. Donations for rescued horses poured in. Volunteers offered help. Someone even brought a load of fresh hay and a bag of grain as a thank you. Fiona's phone buzzed with messages, some from old firefighting friends, others from strangers moved by her courage. Her daughter stayed for days, helping with chores, beaming every time she saw her mother interviewed or praised by neighbors. One night, sitting by the barn as a soft spring rain drummed on the roof, her daughter touched her hand. "You always saw broken things as worth saving, Mom. Now everyone else does too." Thistle, though still wary of strangers, let Fiona's daughter stroke her neck, her big dark eyes softening. Fiona smiled, feeling something deep and painful release inside her, a forgiveness she'd denied herself for years. When the last camera crew packed up and the barn was quiet again, Fiona stood in the doorway, looking out at the moonlit hills. The fight had changed her, stitched something new and strong into the old wounds. Justice hadn't come easy. It never did. But together, with the help of a wild Mustang and a stubborn community, she had carved out a place for hope. Thistle nickered softly at her side, and Fiona scratched her mane, gratitude burning in her chest. "We did it, girl," she whispered. "We really did." Weeks drifted by, soft as spring rain. The chaos faded, replaced by routines both old and new. Fiona's place felt changed, still simple, still isolated on the edge of the foothills, but filled now with a steady stream of visitors and a sense of belonging she hadn't felt in years. Justice had been won, but its cost, fear, scars, lost sleep, echoed in the quiet. Yet every day, a little more light crept into the corners of her life. On a pale morning streaked with birdsong, Fiona led Thistle up to the high meadow. Wildflowers pushed through last year's grass, their color stubborn against the muted gold of the hills. Fiona walked slowly, letting the mare set the pace, her old firefighter's bandana knotted tight around her wrist. She brought a battered leather journal, pages softened by the pressure of her hand. It was time, she thought, to write things down, not just for herself, but for anyone who might need the map she and Thistle had carved from chaos. She wrote about patience, about how it isn't a single act, but a collection of small ones, wading through fear, tending wounds that might never fully close, returning every morning with a soft voice and open hands. She remembered how, in those first weeks, every move around Thistle was a negotiation, each day a bargain for trust. She wrote about courage, not the wild, movie kind, but the everyday grit it took to stand her ground. There were so many moments she'd wanted to hide, to run, to close the doors and let someone else fight. But she'd learned that real courage lived in the refusal to abandon the broken, whether that meant a half-wild Mustang or the pieces of herself she'd long tried to leave behind. She wrote about connection, how Thistle had taught her that healing couldn't be forced. It had to be allowed, step by slow step. That the greatest gift was simply not giving up on yourself or anyone else. That scars, human or horse, didn't have to mean the end of hope. Some days, the weight of memory still pressed down. She couldn't walk the barn in darkness without thinking of that night. Her friend's voice on the radio, the desperate run into smoke, the crack of burning wood. Grief was a constant companion, softened by time but never gone. But Fiona learned to honor it, to make room for sorrow alongside the new joy blooming in her life. The high meadow became her sanctuary. She and Thistle walked it often. The world stretched wide beneath Montana's endless sky. One afternoon, as clouds drifted overhead, she sat in the grass, journal on her knees, and watched as a herd of rescued Mustangs, 50 strong, some still thin and wary, were released nearby. The BLM, with help from animal welfare groups, had set aside the land for their return. Thistle stood at the fence, eyes bright and steady, no longer the outcast. She seemed to understand the moment. Ears forward, head high, letting out a soft nicker as the other horses thundered into their new freedom. Fiona felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but something sharper, a kind of awe at the way broken things could knit together, the way healing spiraled out from a single stubborn refusal to give up. She spent evenings on her porch, writing letters she'd never send to her friend Melissa. She told her about Thistle, about the way fear had become something she could face instead of something she ran from. She wrote, "You once said every rescue is a gamble. Maybe it's the only kind that matters." The townspeople's support never faded. Sometimes they stopped by, asking after Thistle, dropping off hay or sweet apples, sharing stories of their own wounds and slow recoveries. Kids from the local 4-H group helped repaint the barn, their laughter spilling across the fields. Even the sheriff came by, a little sheepish, to thank Fiona for holding the line when others hesitated. One clear evening, Fiona watched the Mustangs graze in the last light, Thistle standing guard among them, a sentinel, no longer lost. The wind rippled through the grass, and Fiona felt a quiet peace settle deep. The American spirit, she realized, wasn't about solitary heroics or grand gestures. It was born in the daily acts of decency, in standing up for what was right, in believing broken things are worth saving. She closed her journal with a sigh, hand lingering over the battered cover. She'd never be fully free of loss, but she could choose, every day, to keep walking the path toward healing. Sometimes it was enough just to show up, to refuse to let go, to greet the world with open hands even when she wanted to close them into fists. Thistle walked up to her, bumping her shoulder with a gentle insistence. Fiona scratched behind her ears, feeling the softness of her mane, the warmth of her breath. "We're here, girl," she murmured. "We made it." As the sun slipped behind the mountains, Fiona understood the lesson Thistle had given her. Healing is not a single act, but a way of living, a promise made and remade with every sunrise. Late summer crested over Montana with a blaze of light and color, transforming the foothills into a living quilt, patches of gold and green, the wild grasses waving under a big, forgiving sky. Fiona's ranch, once a lonely outpost on the edge of town, now pulsed with a quiet, grounded joy. There was laughter here again, voices mixing with birdsong and the clatter of hooves. Justice, hard won, had become something even more enduring. A promise to the land, to the animals, and to the people who dared to care. The day of the Wild Horse Festival arrived bright and clear. The meadow beyond Fiona's barn swelled with neighbors, ranchers, children, and families, many meeting for the first time in months outside the shadows of fear. Fiona, dusting off her faded firefighter's bandana, watched as volunteers set up tables heavy with food, banners streaming from fence posts, and a circle of folding chairs around a makeshift stage. It felt surreal, like she'd stepped into someone else's good dream. Thistle was the centerpiece, no longer gaunt and haunted, but strong and whole, her coat shining in the sun, her once wary eyes now alive with curiosity. Children clustered around the paddock fence, reaching out with hands full of apples and bits of carrot. Thistle sniffed them gentle and regal, accepting their offerings, her trust hard-won and never taken for granted. For a moment, Fiona watched from a distance, letting the scene sink in. The mare that had once stood alone in a blizzard was now the symbol of something bigger: hope, survival, the return of the wild. As the crowd settled, the BLM officers gave a brief speech, their words echoing across the grass. They spoke of the rescued Mustangs, how dozens had found new homes or a safe return to public lands. They honored the volunteers, the officers, the vets, and finally, Fiona herself. Sometimes, the officer said, all it takes is one person who refuses to give up to change everything for the better. The community clapped and whistled. Fiona, not one for speeches, stepped up only when pressed, her cheeks warm with humility. She spoke plainly, hands stuffed in her jeans, bandana bright against her wrist. I didn't do this alone. I just made a promise to one horse, and it ended up saving more than I ever expected. If there's a lesson here, it's that you never know how far a small act of loyalty or courage might reach. We're all broken, all patched together. But when we show up for each other, there's nothing we can't heal. Her words settled over the crowd, finding their mark. As the festival unfolded, kids running races, neighbors swapping stories, old rivals shaking hands, Fiona felt the ache of her old wounds ease under the warmth of so many faces, so much laughter. Even her daughter, beaming with pride, wove through the gathering, helping set out food and taking photos with Thistle and the other Mustangs. Reporters from the Tribune and local TV snapped pictures. Thistle became a gentle star, posing with children and elders alike, letting the community claim her as a living emblem of resilience. Nearby, several of the rescued Mustangs galloped in the open pasture, their freedom a testament to everything hard won. The air buzzed with hope as the sun began to dip. Fiona wandered the edge of the festival, pausing beside the fence to look out at the herd. She saw the neighbor boy, once so shy, riding bareback on a small bay filly, his laughter soaring. Leo, her neighbor, chatted with the sheriff by the pie table, and Mary the vet lifted a toddler up to touch Thistle's neck. It was all so ordinary, and for that very reason, miraculous. Fiona found a moment alone by the paddock, Thistle at her side, both watching the last of the light paint the world in gold. She traced the jagged scar on her palm, remembering the years she'd spent running from pain, from connection, from the possibility of something better. Now the ache felt quieter, still present, but softened by everything she and Thistle had survived. A young girl, perhaps 6 or 7, approached, her eyes wide. "Is she really wild?" she whispered, reaching to stroke Thistle's mane. "She was," Fiona said, kneeling to meet the girl's gaze. "But sometimes wild things just need someone to believe in them, to give them a chance to heal." The girl smiled, pressing her cheek to Thistle's neck. Fiona felt the meaning settle deep. This was Thistle's real legacy. Not just her survival, but the hope she awakened in others, the courage to care, the willingness to risk something for the sake of another life. As twilight fell and the festival wound down, Fiona gathered her friends, family, and neighbors for one last photo. Everyone clustered close, Thistle in the center, the sunlit grasslands as their backdrop. For a heartbeat, time slowed, holding the moment open and wide. Fiona realized then, saving one life really could ripple out to save many. Healing was always shared, between people, animals, and the land. As people drifted away, Fiona walked home with Thistle at her side, the world stretching open before them. There would always be new battles, fresh scars, moments of fear. But there would also be laughter, courage, and the enduring promise of connection. Justice, hope, and healing weren't grand gestures. They were built in acts of loyalty, in the refusal to give up, no matter how lost things seemed. They reached the porch as stars pricked through the dusk. Fiona glanced back at the fields, at the home she'd made out of stubbornness, love, and the wildness of one unforgettable horse. She pressed her palm against Thistle's shoulder, feeling her strength. Together they faced the night, open to whatever sunrise would bring, knowing at last the world could be kind and full of possibility.